Hi everybody and welcome to today's lecture on sectarians and schismatics in the Russian Empire. So in the last lecture we looked at the tolerated faiths of the Russian Empire, that is to say Lutherans, Catholics, Armenian Gregorians, Buddhists, Muslims, Jews and a couple of others. However, there were some groups who were prohibited under the Imperial Law Code at various points. Today, the major groups we're going to be looking at today are the Old Believers, who constituted the largest schismatic/sectarian group in the Russian Empire. And we're also going to take a look at a few others that emerged throughout the 18th and 19th century towards the end. But I think the focus of our lecture today will be heavily on the Old Believers. I will confess this is because I'm something of an Old Believer specialist myself. I've written a book, which will be out later this year, on an aspect of Old Belief and its relationship with the Orthodox Church. So obviously I'm most at ease and find it more interesting to talk about the Old Believers than the other groups. But I think we should nevertheless make mention of them. Now, normally, if we were having this lecture in different times, I would actually show a video about the Old Believers. Today I'm not going to do that, but I will post a link to that video to the students, and for anybody else watching, I hope we can include it in the YouTube video description beneath the video. So anyway, let's just turn to some sort of general points about sectarians and schismatics in terms of their position in the Russian legal code and their differences between them and the so-called tolerated faiths. So, okay, you might remember this diagram which I produced from last time, showing the hierarchy of toleration. And as you remember, we mostly focused last time on this upper part of the diagram, with what I call the tolerated religions, the tolerated confessions. These were groups which were granted, to one degree or another, a legal existence within the Russian Empire, a legal and open existence. Today we're going to be looking at the groups on or below this dotted line which I've marked legality on the diagram. That is to say, groups that for various different reasons were, and at various different times, were declared illegal by the Russian state or were subjugated to a degree of persecution and prohibition. As you see, this category was demarked into four kind of groups. So first I've got the Old Believers. And as we're going to see, the Old Believers are a sort of liminal case. They were both legal and illegal, tolerated and not tolerated. I'm going to go into the reasons why this was the case in the first half of this lecture. Why the reason Old Believers occupied this sort of anomalous liminal space between legality and illegality. But beneath them were groups that were certainly absolutely considered illegal in terms of the law code of the empire. And this was divided into sort of three grades of illegality between the least harmful and most harmful groups. And these sort of grades basically determined what kinds of punishments were levied on individuals belonging to these groups and to the religious leaders belonging to these groups. It's worth commenting that I think some of these sects, although it is possible to sympathize with some of these sects, some of their position. For instance, the Baptists were in the 1890s declared to be a most harmful sect. And I think we can agree with sort of that baptism doesn't really qualify as a very harmful or dangerous group, with its focus really just on sort of individual interpretation of the Bible, collective prayer meetings, etc., etc. But there were some groups who actually promulgated concepts of physical self-harm, physical self-mutilation that entered into this group. and which I would argue were genuinely harmful to both individuals practicing the beliefs and to society as a whole. And arguably, they did deserve their sort of position within the imperial law code. Whether they deserved the sort of heavy repressive measures that the Russian state leveled against them, such as exile and imprisonment, is another question. But in any case, I think it's worth keeping in mind that when we talk about these sects, we're talking about groups with a wide range of practices, some of which were largely benign, were simply forms of prayer and religious worship that we're very familiar with today among certain non-establishment, non-conformist Protestant traditions, while others were, I would say, at the time and today, deeply disturbing. In any case, what were the basic differences between the tolerated and non-tolerated faiths? Why did some groups receive this status as tolerated faiths and others were subjected to, were rendered illegal and subjected to much greater degrees of persecution and were denied an open and tolerated existence? Well, as we discussed yesterday, the tolerated faiths, for one thing, they were most active on the borderlands. In other words, they were most active in regions which were strategically vital, strategically vulnerable, I should say, strategically vulnerable. They were not populated in the large by Russian peoples. They were made up of groups, for instance, Latvians, Estonians, Lithuanians, Poles, etc. These groups, generally speaking, were not interested in missionary outreach to Russians. They were generally concerned with maintaining their own flocks, which, generally speaking, did not contain Russian speakers. They certainly did not openly contest the legitimacy of either the Russian Orthodox Church or the Russian state. As we spoke about yesterday, indeed, groups like Islam, Protestantism, Catholicism were in fact subordinated to the state and actively preached loyalty to the state for the most part. And of course, the major difference was that they were legally recognized by the Russian state and therefore given a degree of open public existence and the ability to openly practice their faiths. Now, this was very different, indeed almost the opposite situation, for the non-tolerated illegal groups. They were highly active throughout the empire, both the core and the borderlands. This meant that they were active among Russian speakers and whom the Russian Orthodox Church regarded as its core flock. In other words, they posed direct and direct competition to the Russian Orthodox Church and its control over its flock. In a great many cases, as we're going to see, these groups openly denied the Orthodox Church's legitimacy and the legitimacy of the Russian state. They did not do so uniformly across time, and certainly different groups had different positions on these questions, but many of them, for instance, denied principles of hierarchy, or denied the Orthodox Church's canonical basis, denied its theological legitimacy, in other words. So these groups directly set themselves up in opposition to both the major ecclesiastical and secular organs of authority in the empire. And so therefore, unsurprisingly, the state did not recognize these groups and subjected them to differing degrees of persecution and repression. So the first half of our lecture, I think, is going to be we're going to talk about the old believers. I've dedicated so much time to the Old Believers, not just because I myself am particularly interested in them, but also because they were, as we will see, the largest group of sectarians / schismatics in the Russian Empire. We never truly know we're never truly sure about how many of them there were, precisely because they avoided any officials who tried to count them. But there are estimates that believe that most of our reliable estimates suggest that by the beginning of the 20th century, there were between 10 and 20 million Old Believers in the Russian Empire. In other words, a really large proportion of the Russian population belonged to some form of old belief. So what is the history? Why did old belief emerge, and when did it emerge? Well, those of you who can cast your minds back to the beginning of this course will remember that we did discuss briefly in my lecture on Peter the Great's church reforms. We discussed the emergence of old belief in the 1650s. And now I'm going to take you through a slightly more detailed version of that. So, in the reign of Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, beginning in the 1640s, Patriarch Nikon Minin came to power. You may recall we said Alexei was a truly pious Tsar, particularly as a young man, and he was heavily reliant on members of reformist church circles for advice and support in his new government. Nikon was one of Alexei's primary supporters in the church, and he was certainly a major figure in these reformist church circles. The argument has long been voiced, ever since the time of troubles at the beginning of the century, that something was deeply wrong with Russian Orthodoxy and the Russian state. That was the reason that Russia had been punished by God with these periods of civil unrest and foreign invasion. People argued that Russian society and its institutions, like the church and the state, were corrupt and were displeasing God. Hence the wars, hence the civil strife, hence famines and disease outbreaks, and so on and so forth. Now, Nikon's approach to dealing with this was to look really, I would say, at the very basic sources of the Russian Orthodox liturgical, Russian Orthodox liturgical practice. To look at whether errors and problems had entered into how Russians worshipped in their churches. And this basically involved a process of checking the Russian books used at the time against supposedly older models. Now, the idea was that these older models represented a purer idea of Christianity, and that by comparing the two books, and therefore the two sets of rituals, Nikon and his fellow churchmen would be able to identify where errors had entered into modern practice and remove them. And so this is precisely what they did. They compared contemporary Russian liturgical books with Greek ones to try and establish where changes had entered into the Russian ones and to move the ritual practices back to the supposedly older Greek versions. Well, it should be noted, by the way, that Nikon was somewhat mistaken. The Greek books that they purchased were recent productions from Venice. And the reality of the matter was that the rituals and texts within them were certainly not particularly old versions. Perhaps certainly probably not older than the Russian versions that he sought to correct with these Greek textbooks. But this argument was not revealed until the beginning of the 20th century, although the Old Believers consistently argued for it. And so, until the beginning of the 20th century, it was generally thought that the Reformed Nikon rituals were the older ones. Anyway, Nikon goes ahead with these changing of the rituals and changing liturgical texts. He was thoroughly backed in this by Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, and perhaps unsurprisingly, by visiting members of the Greek-speaking patriarchates of the East, so particularly Constantinople and Antioch and Alexandria, who visited, some of whom had visited Moscow in the 1650s and 1660s. Although Nikon had a major falling out with Tsar Alexei at the end of the 1650s, which resulted in Nikon's removal as patriarch and his imprisonment, Alexei and his supporters in the church continued to go ahead with this reform scheme. And in 1666, 1667, at the Great Moscow Council, a local council of the Russian Orthodox Church, attended by a wide range of dignitaries from the Greek-speaking Eastern churches, this program of reforms was confirmed, and anybody who opposed them was deemed to be in schism with the church, and the old rituals themselves were subject to anathema. That is to say, they were subject to a religious prohibition. They were essentially cast out of the church. Now, what were these liturgical differences, these ritual differences? Well, probably the most symbolic, the most famous one, the one which came to, in many ways, define the difference between the Old Believers, those who opposed the liturgical reforms of Nikon, and the Russian Orthodox Church, were the number of fingers used to make the sign of the cross. The Old Believers persisted in the use of the pre-Niconian 2 fingers when blessing themselves and blessing others, while the Russian Orthodox Church made use of 3 fingers. This is for this reason that one of the Old Believers' slang words, one of the Old Believer abusive labels for Orthodox believers was pinchers, because it was said that the Old Believers, the Orthodox, pinched their fingers together. And for many, this was the most symbolic change. But there were others. For instance, the spelling of Jesus was changed. The number of prosphora bread issued during the liturgy was changed. The direction in which one proceeded around the church during cross processions was changed, and various other points. Probably one of the most noticeable changes was the change to singing. Russian Orthodox liturgical singing was increasingly influenced by Baroque European musical patterns, especially the use of polyphonic singing. However, the Old Believers vigilantly maintained their practice of monophonic Old Russian singing. And this difference is represented very clearly in the sort of musical notes that the 2 groups used in order to sing. The Old Believers continue to use a system known as the hook notes, basically a medieval Russian form of musical notation, while Russian Orthodox churches increasingly adopted the European forms of musical notation that I'm sure most of us are familiar with today. Now, I give you here, this is a early 18th century sort of pictorial depiction of the differences between between the Old Believers and the Orthodox. So basically, the Old Believers are on your left. The Old Believers are on your yes, the Old Believers are on your left. Old Believers on your left and Orthodox on your right. Here we see an Old Believer depiction of the same difference. Again, the Old Believers on the left, the Orthodox on the right. And because this is an Old Believer depiction, you can see here they're not only detailing the differences between the liturgical differences, but also making a very clear statement about the European influence in the Russian Orthodox Church. Because if you look at the Russian Orthodox Church, the picture depicting the Russian Orthodox Church, it has a bunch of sort of gentlemen dressed as Western Europeans, whereas the Old Believer form, with very clearly they've shaved off their beards, they're wearing European dress, while the Old Believer picture on the left shows sort of typically pious Russians with in Russian dress, in their sort of kaftans, and very clearly have not shaved. Here is a much later Old Believer depiction of the differences. So this is their depiction of their ritual practices. This comes from the middle of the 19th century and was distributed in woodcut form among the peasants. And here is what they argued was the Orthodox sort of form. Of course, we have to remember all of these images are basically different forms of propaganda. So the ideas of depicting the most stereotypical, the most version possible of each other's ritual practices in order to sort of make the distinction very clear, both as a teaching mechanism and both as sort of a warning about what the other group did wrong. So here, you see very much sort of an Old Believer, the Old Believer depiction of themselves and explanations of their beliefs. This is used as a teaching tool. But then we see the Orthodox forms. And of course, this is not particularly accurate. It's meant as a form of a visual polemic against the Russian Orthodox Church. Well, in any case, how we've discussed sort of the anathema, the excommunication of the Old Believer leaders. Who were these leaders? Well, the first real true leader of Old Belief was a man called Avakum Petrov, who was a monk. He had actually belonged to the same reformist circles as Nikon. But unlike Nikon, he rejected the idea that they should change the rituals. For Avakum, relying on Greek methods was wrong. It unseated the better Russian native ritual forms. There was a great deal of, I would probably say, xenophobia in Avakum's rejection of this adaptation of foreign ritual forms into Old Belief. He was also joined by other figures from the same circle, like the priest Ioan Neronov. But Avakum really became the first truly well-known leader of the Old Believers. Avakum was a good self-publicist. His autobiography is still regarded as one of the earliest Russian classics in these genres, and it's still published today. I mean, you might be able to find translations into Estonian. I can't remember if there's a full translation in English or not easily available at the moment. But certainly, you can easily obtain copies in Russian if you read that language. Now, Neronov, his opposition broke down, and he ultimately ended up rejoining the Russian Orthodox Church. But Avakum maintained his opposition. And as a result, he gained a form of martyrdom. He was quite early exiled from Moscow for his opposition to Nikon in 1653, where he went to Tobolsk, and in fact was involved in various mapping missions for the governor of the local region, and he remained there for a decade until 1663. Returning, he was now formally excommunicated from the Russian Orthodox Church as a heretic, and as a result, he was sentenced to imprisonment in an eastern monastery. He essentially spent 14 years living in a hole in the ground where he was kept. And then finally, at the end of that long period, he was executed, set on fire. Basically, Avvakum became the first Old Believer saint. The Old Believers regard him as a saint, and you can, in some some Old Believer churches, you can find icons of Avvakum. The Orthodox call Avvakum a heresiarch, in other words, a father of heresy, but or at least they did before sort of the early 20th century. Now, Old Belief did not simply, this rejection of the Niconian reforms did not simply inspire people like Neronov and Avvakum, but also a large number of priests and the normal people. And just try and understand why that is. Well, historians have debated for many, many years why it is Old Belief gains the support that it does. Some point to socio-economic reasons at the time. Remember, in 1648, Alexei finalized the imposition of serfdom on the Russian people. Throughout the 1650s and 1660s, there were long wars against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. There were crop failures, there were price crises, which themselves caused riots in Moscow. In the 1660s, there was a popular, 1670s rather, there was a popular uprising led by Cossacks, etc., etc. So this is an extremely febrile, unstable period when opposition movements like Old Belief could gain traction. But I'd like to just to return you to some of our remarks about magic and about ritual in one of our earlier lectures. We should remember the role that Orthodox ritual played in this magical world of the Orthodox peasantry. Performing ritual was one way in which you could guard yourself against misfortune, against the forces of evil in the world, and therefore assert a degree of control, however illusory, over your own fate. Now, imagine someone tells you that you have to adopt new forms of rituals that are distinctly different from the ones that you've been accustomed to, that your fathers practiced, that your grandfathers practiced, as far as you're aware, have been practiced from time immemorial in your churches. Well, you might believe, well, these new rituals aren't effective. You could go even further and say not only were they ineffective, but they indeed invited evil. One should remember some tools used by some of these sort of items or tools used by witches, allegedly, in this period. Things like saying prayers backwards were regarded to be essentially demonic practices, precisely because they perverted the ritual order of the Orthodox Church. Slotted into this kind of belief system, a change to ritual could really was a potentially dangerous thing in terms of the belief system of many peasants and indeed others in this period in Russian history. As a result, and of course, let's just say, good old-fashioned conservatism, fear of change, refusal to change, no doubt played a considerable role. And as such, large numbers, again, it's very difficult to say quite how many. At the beginning of the 18th century, the historian Lindsay Hughes suggested about 20% of the Russian population were old believers of one kind or another. This therefore suggests that opposition to the Niconian reforms were very widespread, and old belief gained a high degree of popularity among the people and to a certain extent, among the lower-ranking members of the clergy. Now, one of the most spectacular early instances of old believer opposition to the liturgical reforms came in the famous monastery of Solovetsky in the White Sea. It's an island. It's a monastery on an island in the White Sea. When the monks actively refused to accept the new liturgical textbooks, and as a result, had to actively defended their monastery militarily from a government siege, which lasted 8 years. It was a very difficult place. I can assure you, if you've ever seen it or ever seen the photographs of Solovetsky, it's a very difficult place to lay siege to. And they were able to hold out for 8 years until finally the government troops broke in and, well, essentially executed any of the monks they found still alive. I've got a picture here for you, a contemporary picture from a manuscript depicting the sort of tale of the siege of Solovetsky. So here you see cannons at the top. In the top left-hand corner, you see the monastery in the top right-hand corner, and then you see essentially on the top of the image, you see the fates of the monks who had decided to oppose the Russian state and the Russian Orthodox Church, the sort of punishments that were meted out to them. Now, just connecting this idea of the idea of the peasantry about the perversion of ritual and its ability to sort of summon evil forces into the world. There was indeed a great undertone, well, not just implicit and explicit tone of apocalyptic thinking in old believer thought. And to explain why this is the case. Well, many among the old believers, certainly many among the Russian population as well at the time, believed that Moscow, the Muscovite state, represented the last true Christian state on earth. It was indeed the last independent Orthodox state. The other Orthodox princedoms and kingdoms had been conquered by the by the Ottoman Turks in the 15th and 16th centuries. And of course, they regarded the Protestant and Catholic West as having fallen to heresy. So Moscow was the one true seat of orthodoxy, in other words, the one seat of true Christianity left in the world. And the old believers argued that the fall of the Russian Orthodox Church and the Russian state to Nikon's reforms meant that one true Christianity in the world had fallen. In other words, the reign of the Antichrist was at hand. Some argued that Nikon or Tsar Alexei or their agents or the government were themselves the Antichrist. Others argued that they were simply operating within a world, essentially they were still human figures operating in a world dominated by the Antichrist. And many believed, following the book of Revelations, that the coming of the reign of the Antichrist meant that soon the second coming of Jesus would occur. So in other words, this would be the point when Jesus returns and defeats the Antichrist and establishes the kingdom of heaven. As such, given that many old believers lived in anticipation of the end of the world and the last judgment, many thought it was better to die than to submit to the forces of the Antichrist. In other words, to submit to the forces of the Russian state and the Russian church. And one of their most sort of famous practices of essentially avoiding the soldiers of the state and the church, avoiding compromise with the forces of the Antichrist, was to burn themselves alive en masse. And instances of this continue throughout the end of the 17th and indeed until the end of the 18th century. We have numerous instances of old believers in anticipation of the end of the world, burning themselves in order to escape being contaminated by agents of the Antichrist. Now, I want to just emphasize, many people have sort of seized upon this sort of these early apocalyptic beliefs and applied them to old belief throughout the period. It should be noted, however, that these beliefs gradually over time disappeared, at least among certain groups. There are very few old believers today who would actively tell you that the time of the Antichrist is at hand, that any figures in modern states represent the Antichrist. These beliefs are strongest in this period of the 17th, late 17th, early 18th centuries. Now, as I mentioned, it's very difficult to know precisely how many old believers there were, because they avoided state figures. They avoided clergy, Orthodox clergy who would count them. They avoided bureaucrats. They avoided soldiers, generally because they feared them as outsiders, potentially as representatives of the Antichrist, or because they feared persecution. However, they were truly a truly large, substantial group. Now, the Orthodox Church and the Russian state did collect some data on old believer numbers. However, we largely disregard this information. For one thing, as I mentioned, they couldn't count everybody. Old believers fled. Or, as is often the case, the Orthodox Church deliberately underestimated the number of old believers in their parishes in order to make their missionary efforts look more successful. As this is especially the case at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th centuries. I should also mention, by the way, that old belief at the end of the 17th century rapidly becomes a phenomenon spread across the Russian Empire and indeed beyond the borders of the Russian Empire. It becomes what we would call a transnational religious phenomenon. Old believers flee from government, don't just burn themselves alive, they flee. They go into the depths of of Siberia, into the depths of the Russian north, into deeply forested areas. So they go to places like Nizhny Novgorod, for instance, with forests, swamps, trees, where they can easily hide themselves. Others flee to potentially more supportive states. So many end up in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Quite a few end up in the Swedish-controlled Baltic provinces. Others end up in Romania, in the Balkans. Some even end up in the Ottoman Empire, ruled by the Turks. There are a few old believer communities on the coast of the Aegean Sea, for instance. Now, even though technically old belief was not really a heresy, it was a schism. That is to say, it wasn't a direct crime against the doctrines of the church, but rather a split engendered by a disagreement of interpretation. Certainly in the 17th century, old belief is treated like a heresy. And heresy is one of the capital crimes in the Russian law code. It's a crime that is absolutely subject to execution. The state and the church had no compunction about using armed force to impose the new liturgical books onto reluctant parishioners and to use soldiers to force all believers to return to the authority, the aegis of the church and the state. All believer leaders and those who refused to repent of their heresy were often burnt alive. Now, one core factor we have to keep in mind with the history of all belief is that it was never just one group. There was never just one form of old belief. And this is a fact that is already apparent at the end of the 17th century. There is a division in old belief between the so-called priestly and priestless groups. In other words, between those who have priests and those who do not have priests. Why does this emerge? Well, basically, the old believers have a problem by the end of the 17th century. No bishops joined the old believers, not a single one. And without bishops, there was no way to legitimately create new priests. Bishops are the only ones who can legitimately create new priests. And there were two, therefore, as the priests who had joined old belief in the beginning started to die off towards the end of the 17th century, there was obviously a leadership crisis and a liturgical crisis. Who would lead old believer religious lives? Who would conduct the key sacraments that were at the core of those religious lives? And the two groups reflect two different strategies taken in reaction to this crisis. The priestless initially argued that Jesus' second coming was close at hand. When Jesus came, he would restore a true priestly hierarchy to the old believers. And therefore, they didn't really need to rely on priests in the brief period that they supposed would be until Jesus came back. In the meantime, they looked at the canons of the church and various other texts and found that there were provisions that allowed laymen, the laity, to perform two of the sacraments, penance and baptism, in cases of emergency. And so basically, priestless old believer groups rely on members of their own community who are not priests, but who use these rites to do these emergency sacraments for sort of the core of their religious lives. Now, the priestly old believers rejected this argument. They argued that priests were still fundamentally necessary. And so their basic strategy was that they would, any Orthodox priests who ran away from the Russian Orthodox Church, they would recruit. Those fugitive priests, these exile priests, would be ritually cleansed of their previous quote-unquote heresy. And it is probably worth noting that certainly the old believers themselves regard the Russian Orthodox as heretics. These exiled priests would be purged ritually of their heresy, and then they could serve as priests for these old believer communities. Now, as you can see, there are disadvantages to both strategies. The The disadvantage for the priestless old believers, as we're going to see, is that they had nobody who could conduct the sacrament of marriage. And so the idea of marriage, of sexual relations, of childbirth and reproduction posed really contentious problems to the priestless old believers. And for the priestly old believers, they had to rely on priests running away from the Orthodox Church. And these priests running away from the Orthodox Church could often be doing so because they feared punishment from their bishops for criminal or immoral activities. So in other words, the priestly old believers were sort of reliant on some of the worst priests of the Russian Orthodox Church. But nonetheless, these are the two strategies adopted. I can't remember if I discussed it later in this lecture, so I'm going to mention it now. There were constant attempts to sort of find a bishop who would be willing to ordain priests for the old believers. Of course, not in Russia itself. They sent emissaries to the various eastern churches, so to bishops in the Balkans and in the Near East, asking them to ordain priests for them. However, it should be noted that at the time, the major financial sponsor of most of these churches was the Russian Tsar. After all, the Russian Tsar was the head of the one independent Orthodox state, and so he often sent money to the other churches of the other Orthodox churches of the Balkans and of the Near East. And so they were hardly likely to ordain any priests to the old believers for fear of angering the Tsar and potentially damaging their own, biting the hand that fed them, basically, angering the Tsar so he would no longer give them money. So as I mentioned, the key problem for the priestless old believers was how to approach the idea of a community that had no legitimate marriages. The initial solution chosen by priestless old believer communities, especially in the famous Vig community in the Russian north, was to adopt essentially a monastic kind of lifestyle. So a strict division between men and women, strict prohibitions on sex, strict prohibitions on interrelationships between the genders, and in order to replenish their numbers, essentially recruiting peasants from nearby localities, adopting children, and thereby avoiding the need for marriage. Now, this extremely strict, extremely harsh, and rather difficult to sustain model came under increasing challenge as the 18th century progressed. This kind of strict celibacy was particularly difficult for old believer merchants, workers and townsmen in the cities to maintain, surrounded as they were by sort of worldly temptations. And so by the end of the 18th century, a new pattern had emerged of some priestess old believer communities essentially adopting civil marriages, basically marriages conducted outside of church, and without the involvement of the old believer church. This was the result of many splits within the old believer community, as different groups either accepted or rejected this innovation in strategies, in beliefs and practices. And of course, it should go without saying, is that the Russian state and the Russian Orthodox Church did not recognize these civil marriages as legitimate. Here is a picture of the Vig community I just mentioned. And so you can see here the division between the male and the female. The two pictures represent the male and the female parts of that community. So essentially the division between the two genders and its strict separation. So as I mentioned. So I did indeed. I've already discussed this question of how what the priestly old believers spent much of the 18th century doing to sort of solve this issue of bishops. They went looking across the Russian borders in the Orthodox East and the Orthodox Balkans for potential priests. They also had some of their own training grounds, some of their own centers, where for sourcing sort of Orthodox priests. One of these was a monastery. The biggest one was a monastery complex in Igiz, in Saratov province. This was for much of the imperial period until really until in the 19th century. This was the leading center of the major forms of priestly old belief. The center in Igiz. Now, how in our period did the Russian Orthodox state react to the old believers? How did its approach change? Well, Peter moved away from the direct persecution that had been practiced by his predecessors. He granted the old believers a degree of legality in Russian society. He said that old believers could, to an extent, exist openly. However, this required several steps from the concessions from the old believers themselves. They had to pay double tax. They had to register themselves as old believer schismatics in the taxation books. And they had to wear certain particular forms of distinctive clothing to mark them out socially as old believers. And it should go without saying that the vast, vast majority of old believers did not want to take these measures. Very few of them wanted the state to know they were old believers by registering themselves in the tax books. They certainly did not want to pay a double tax. And so most old believers in the reign of Peter the Great, despite these limited measures of toleration, continued to avoid the agents of the Russian state. Not only for the theological reasons we discussed, perhaps because of the representation of the Russian state and the Russian church as agents of the Antichrist, but also for practical reasons in order to avoid double taxation and registration with the state. Peter's model of toleration towards the old believers, a very, very limited toleration to the old believers, and basically the old believers rejecting this, remains in force until the 1760s, with the accession of Catherine the Great, Catherine II. Catherine, influenced by Enlightenment thinkers on matters of religion, people like Voltaire and Montesquieu, who insisted that a markers of civilized, modern, enlightened states was religious toleration, decided to extend much greater degrees of toleration to the old believers. This was not her only concern, I should mention. It was not just the influence of Enlightenment figures and her own good conscience. It was because the old believers, as I mentioned, were a significant, numerous group. They existed in large numbers, particularly in poorly settled borderlands. Many of the old believer leaders, old believer merchants, the social leaders of old belief, were extremely wealthy individuals. Catherine thought that by extending toleration to the old believers, you could bring them out of hiding, and then you could tax them, you could conscript them, you could use them as settlers in different areas. In other words, Catherine decides to tolerate the old believers and grant them a much greater degree of openness because she wants to use them for the policies and the aims of the Russian state. So some of the measures of toleration that came out during Catherine's reign, these are implemented gradually over the course of Catherine's reign from 1762 to 1797. All believers were allowed to have open religious buildings. They were allowed some kind of public assistance. They were allowed to hold public offices. They were encouraged and offered tax incentives to return from abroad, from exile. And as we're going to see, this changed the public presence of all belief quite significantly in the late 18th century. One of the major changes happens in Moscow, where Catherine's extension of toleration allows the old believers, both priestly and priestless, to establish very clear, very visible centers of their respective groups. Now, the immediate reason for this was that in 1771, the plague, the Black Death, struck Moscow particularly severely. And the old believers offered to establish cemetery hospital complexes on the outskirts of Moscow in order to care for the sick and for the bodies of the dead. The government allowed these as charitable initiatives. And so the priestly established their center in Logozhskoye, and the priestless established their presence in Preobrazhenskoye. Now, both of them are referred to in the texts by historians as the Logozhskoye and Preobrazhenskoye cemeteries. And that's what they were to begin with, and that's how they remained sort of legally as sort of charitable institutions. But these were religious centers. They were complexes of monasteries, churches, prayer houses, as well as charitable institutions like almshouses, clinics and hospitals, and so on and so forth. Religious figures and administrators connected to them lived constantly in these compounds. Now, at the time, these two places, Logozhskoye and Preobrazhenskoye, were on the edges of Moscow. They were surrounded by countryside. Today, they're in the very middle of the urban sprawl of Moscow. But they still exist today, and they are still both active today. And thus, old belief begins to establish in the reign of Catherine the Great a much more open urban presence, a much more notable presence in major cities. Similar cemeteries are founded in St. Petersburg and in other cities as well. Now, the Russian Orthodox Church had largely relied on the sort of persecution measures of the state to drive the old believers back into the church at this point. There was the establishment of a certain of anti-schismatic missionaries, people specialized in trying to argue the old believers out of their faith, the publication of various sort of missionary polemics against the old believers. But to a large extent, by the 1760s, before Catherine the Great, the church had largely relied on the persecution to drive the old believers back into the church. However, Catherine's policy of toleration required adaptation from the Russian Orthodox Church itself. And we see the figure of Metropolitan Platon Lovshin, who was indeed the court preacher of Catherine and the tutor to the Tsarevich, to the heir to the throne, Paul. He essentially devised a new kind of strategy towards the old believers. In a 1767 pamphlet, he addressed them and suggested this. He said, "Why are we arguing? Rituals are not the fundamentals of religious faith. They are not dogmas, they're not canonical rules. We can have some disagreement about rituals, but we don't need to break apart the church, destroy the church's unity for the sake of these differences in rituals. And he suggested at the end of his pamphlet that maybe it would be possible, maybe, to allow all believers, upon rejoining the Orthodox Church, to maintain their all-believer rituals. Maybe. There are various attempts over the last 2 decades of the 18th century to sort of create these Orthodox parishes which are allowed to use the old believer rituals in order to sort of create a sort of reunification. And indeed, in 1800, led by Platon Lovshin, a sort of movement, a Uniate movement was founded throughout the Russian Empire called Единоверие, the United Faith. And the idea of Единоверие was, these are all believers who have come back to the Orthodox Church in the sense that they agree to be loyal to the Orthodox Church, recognize the legitimacy of the Orthodox Church, and in return they are allowed to use their all-believer rituals within the Orthodox Church. The Единоверие continues to exist throughout the imperial period, but it is a very marginal phenomenon. It's very controversial, both among the old believers, the Orthodox Church, and the government, and it never really has very much success. So there's only about just under 300 parishes, Единоверие parishes, existing by the end of the Russian Empire in 1917. So this union movement never really has much success, largely because it doesn't really satisfy anybody. The old believers wanted full legitimacy from the state. They wanted to essentially become a tolerated group, like the Lutherans, like the Catholics, like the Muslims, etc. They didn't want this sort of church to recognize the church. They just wanted legitimacy from the state. The Orthodox Church resented, for the most part, having to recognize the old believer rituals as in any kind of way legitimate. And the state was disappointed in the movement because it never really attracted the old believers. So basically, the movement only grew in the sort of under Nicholas I, when, as we're going to discuss, a large degree of persecution was launched against the old believers. And indeed, the reign of Nicholas I from 1825 to 1855 was a major break away from Catherine's policies of toleration. Catherine's policies of toleration had been supported by her grandson Alexander I to a large extent, although a few limitations had been introduced by the end of his reign. But Nicholas I launches a full-on assault against old belief, probably the most sustained level of persecution that it underwent in its modern history. Because Nicholas I believed that because the old believers rejected the church, they were demonstrating disloyalty to the state and to himself. In other words, the old believers rejected the church of the state, which Nicholas considered a manifestation of disloyalty. So a huge range of prohibitions were introduced against the old believers. It's worth mentioning, though, Nicholas doesn't really say old belief is outright illegal. What he tries to do is make its religious life as difficult as possible without directly prohibiting it. So, for instance, he forbids them from opening new prayer houses or prayer houses and churches, or repairing the old ones. In other words, the hope is that these churches prayer houses would collapse eventually from age, from lack of repair, and then they wouldn't be able to rebuild new ones. Nicholas tried to drive the old believers back into the church by targeting their marriages, at least among the priestly old believers. Because he said any marriage done within by an old believer priest is illegitimate in the eyes of the law. And that means, but not only is the marriage itself regarded as illegitimate in the eyes of the state and church, but any children born from it are regarded as illegitimate. This meant, of course, that the old believers could not leave their property to their children, because the children were no longer recognized as the legal heirs of their parents. Now, this is really the beginning of a sort of large-scale old believer tactic often used, which was simply to go to the Orthodox priest for certain state-mandated religious ceremonies like marriage, and then otherwise avoid the Orthodox Church. So they simply use the Orthodox Church as the way to legitimate marriage, therefore legitimate the children, but otherwise avoid it. This is one particular strategy that the old believers used throughout the 19th century, sort of try and avoid direct these kind of persecution, these persecutory measures. But more directly, the state essentially targeted old believer, other elements of old believer life, most elements of old believer religious life. Those prayer houses and churches that the state regarded to be illegal for one reason or another were destroyed or handed over to Orthodox flocks. Books were seized in large numbers. Old believer icons and other liturgical materials were seized and burnt, and the monastic centres were either closed or converted to Russian Orthodoxy. Vig, the monastery, the priestless monastic community in the north I mentioned a few slides ago, was in fact entirely destroyed in the 1850s. Meanwhile, in Lugorskaya and Preobrazhenskaya, churches were seized and given to Orthodoxy, to the Russian Orthodox Church, or were closed. And of course, sometimes the church went out of its way to do this in quite a humiliating fashion. So, for instance, I've seen a record where the Orthodox Church recorded that it used the materials taken from a destroyed old believer church as kindling to cook its own prosphora bread. And icons, for instance, were sometimes ritually purified by being thrown into rivers, and so on and so forth. This was a deeply traumatic experience for old believer communities across the Russian Empire. It finally ended with Nicholas I trying to target in the early 1850s, trying to target the old believer leadership by essentially threatening any merchants who had not converted to Orthodoxy with expulsion from the merchant estate. And if they were expelled from the merchant estate, that meant they would be sent into the peasant or townsmen estates, and therefore subjected to conscription, corporal punishment, poll tax, in other words, a loss of all of their social and economic privileges. Now, one reason Nicholas I upped the tempo of his persecution, particularly at the end of his reign, was because of the emergence of new forms of belief in this period, which he regarded as being particularly troublesome, as being particularly troubling, as being particularly disruptive. Now, as I mentioned, throughout the 18th century, priestly old believers had gone to the Orthodox churches of the Balkans and Near East, trying to find a bishop who would ordain their priests. However, they finally found success in the 1840s, and precisely in 1847. Priestly old believers from Gorskaya Cemetery visited a Greek metropolitan who had actually been removed from his post because he had supported Serbian rebels in a recent conflict. He'd been removed from his post but had not been stripped of his official rank. And following negotiations, he agreed not only to ordain priests, but indeed to create a new episcopal hierarchy for the old believers. And this essentially established a new episcopal old believer church. It was founded in Belokrinskaya, which is in Bukovina, today Romania, back then as part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And indeed, the Austrian-Hungarian government actively supported the creation of this, actively permitted the creation of this new old believer hierarchy. And so therefore, Nicholas I regarded these old believers not simply as people who were disloyal, but traitors to Russia. Traitors being supported by a foreign government to make problems. Now, one issue, at least from the old believer perspective, with this new hierarchy, the so-called Belokrinskaya hierarchy, it's also sometimes called the Austrian hierarchy in the sources, is that many priestly and priestess old believers doubted its legitimacy. The major reason being that the bishop who created the new old believer bishops acted alone when the canons, that is to say the sacred rules of the church, demanded that two bishops had to be present when a new bishop was created. So in other words, they argued that this new episcopal hierarchy was illegitimate. And that's the reason why a great many, it was the Belokrinskaya hierarchy was certainly the most numerous of the old believer groups, but it certainly did not unify the old believers into a single church. Many doubted its legitimacy and therefore stayed away from it. Nicholas I essentially came down extremely heavily on the Rogozhskaya Cemetery for supporting this. The churches inside were closed and kept closed until 1905. And any of these new bishops found wandering around in Russia were sent immediately arrested and sent to basically lifetime imprisonment, usually in the Suzdalski monastery prison. Now, a few comments on old believer religious life in this period. Old believers, in many, especially among the priestly communities, would not look, at least not to the untrained eye, especially distinct from the Orthodox themselves. They had churches, they had priests, they had monasteries and convents. They had the same kind of they had the same kind of administrative basic parish institutions. There were a few differences here and there. For instance, the old believers, the priestly old believers, maintained the practice of clerical election. So essentially their communities continued to elect their priests. This practice had died out in the Russian Orthodox Church by 1800. But unless you were a particular expert at distinguishing between a priestly old believer liturgy and Orthodox liturgy, it wouldn't have looked, their religious life did not look too different. Among the priestess, however, things were quite different. Because, of course, in their religious life, they did not have priestly leadership. They had members of the laity who were allowed or supposed to conduct these sort of the last two sacraments that they were allowed to conduct, penance and baptism. And as such, and of course that means you didn't have the liturgy, you didn't have the Eucharist, you didn't have the confession, you didn't have marriages, at least not, as I mentioned, at least not religious marriages. You had civil marriages. So a lot of the sort of aspects of Russian Orthodox liturgical life were missing from the religious lives of the priestless or believers. And indeed, some priestless or believer communities actually had, especially in the 19th century, as the men started to move away to cities to work in the new industrial cities, you actually have old believer communities emerging that have female leadership. And indeed, this is one area where the priestless old believers were very distinct from both the priestly old believers and the Orthodox. But one thing they have in common, as we're going to see, with other sectarian groups, with different sectarian groups. Now, one thing worth noting about old believers in contrast to the Russian Orthodox was, generally speaking, as far as we can discern, literacy is much higher among the old believers. Since their confession, their difference, their distinction from the Orthodox was constituted by the sources, beg your pardon, I'll start that again. The sources of their faith were the pre-Niconian, pre-Reform liturgical books. Therefore, it was extremely important that many members of the community were able to read these pre-Niconian liturgical texts. These texts were the foundations of their communities, the foundations of their distinct identities and their distinct religious lives as old believers. Therefore, literacy was greatly encouraged in their communities. And they often use this literacy to gain knowledge of not just these sort of old Russian religious texts, but also a vast array of various Orthodox doctrinal texts, particularly the Church Fathers, the Bible itself, etc., etc. Now, talking about community structure. Now, the vast majority of old believers were from what I would say the sort of lower strata of Russian society. There wasn't really such a thing as old believer nobility and aristocrats who belonged to old belief. Of course, there wasn't anyone in the clerical estate who belonged to old belief. Most of them belonged to the merchants, the townspeople, and the peasantry. And of course, it was among the merchants who had capital, both social and financial capital, who acted largely as the leaders of both priestly and priestless communities in society. Now, as I mentioned before, Nicholas I knew this very well, which is why at the very end of his reign, he targeted precisely the old believer merchantry in an attempt to destroy the leadership of the old believers. Now, this social structure could cause tensions between clergy and merchants in the old believer world, because precisely the old believer merchants who paid for the churches, who paid the salaries of the priests, who paid for the beautification of the churches, the icons, etc., regarded the churches in some way, in some forms, often something close to their own personal property. And therefore, they believed they had the right to dictate to the priests the shape of the religious life of that community. However, of course, the priests largely, or in the case of priestless secular religious officiants, largely disagreed with such definition and often engaged in long-running disputes with their merchant backers over who precisely it was who controlled the building of the church and the shape of their community's religious lives. Now, the attitude to wider society is mixed and changed over time. At the beginning, in the late 17th and in the 18th century, many old believers rejected the rest of society. It was part of the fallen world, the Antichrist, and interaction with it brought the risk of contamination by evil, contamination by sin, contamination by the Antichrist. Many therefore try to keep contacts with it and people who belong to this non-old believer societies to an absolute minimum. If they did have to grudgingly accept guests, they would often try and reduce the harm they were bringing with them through various forms of ritual purification. So, for instance, providing that person with his or her own particular drinking cup, knives and forks, plates, cleaning the house after they'd left, spraying the porch with holy water, etc., etc. I can tell you, among some old believers, this is still practiced today. I happened to be I met a few old believers, I was having a drink with a few old believers in Yekaterinburg, where I lived for some of the year, and one of them brought his own cup to the drinking party because he insisted that he couldn't share any of the ones that we had. He had his own special cup. Of course, not all old believers, either then or today, were willing to maintain such strict definitions between themselves and the outside world, especially in urban communities where, of course, they were around people of different faiths and different confessions all of the time, and had to conduct various business relationships with both other businessmen, with state officials, etc., etc. And so these people often adopted a far more secularized, a far more relaxed approach to non-old believer individuals, groups, and communities. Now, indeed, at the end of the 19th century, some of these old believer merchants who were leaders of the communities had transformed themselves into tremendously wealthy industrialists, making use of the new industrial technologies, entering into Russia, creating profitable factories for mass production, and so on and so forth. And these old believers, especially in Moscow, actually certainly represented themselves as secularized individuals, wearing very secularized clothes, sending their sons to Western universities, establishing charitable and cultural programs, not just for the old believers, but for people beyond their communities. Of course, this caused some tension with their religious leaders, who had especially those in the sort of Ragoshkaya cemetery, who had a far more circumspect view on people outside, and certainly a far more circumspect view on certain secular behaviors like smoking, like drinking, like dressing up in the most fashionable Western clothes, etc., etc. One of the most sort of today, if you can visit in Moscow, the Tretyakov Gallery, and some of the collections in the Tretyakov Gallery came from old believer collectors who were some of them were some of these old believer industrialists were absolute sponsors of modern Russian culture and modern Russian art. Now, in 1905, as I discussed in the last lecture, we had the Edict of Toleration on the 17th of April 1905, and this finally results in old belief ending its liminal position between legality and illegality. Most of the points of the Edict of Toleration refer to the old believers. And what happens in that edict is basically the old believers are legitimized in the eyes of the state. They finally receive the privileges and benefits of the other non-Orthodox Christian confessions. So in other words, they move up the hierarchy of toleration to the same level as the Lutherans, the Catholics, and the Armenian Gregorians. Finally, the old believers gained full permission to enter Russian social, intellectual, cultural life without many of the old restrictions that have been holding them back. And this marks a golden age, so-called, of old belief, marked by open congresses discussing theological questions, the opening of previously closed churches, the construction of brand new ones, often very richly decorated, large new old believer churches. It marks the emergence of old believer publications. Previously, old believers have been forbidden from publishing or selling books. After 1905, a very active old believer press was established, publishing journals, publishing pamphlets, publishing books, and various other materials that were now very widely available to the Russian communities. And old belief started to assume a political position. The reason why so many of the Edict of Toleration's points related to old belief was because the man who was principally behind the Edict of Toleration, the Prime Minister Sergei Witte, and his successor Pyotr Stolypin, both regarded old belief as a conservative monarchist group, and broadly speaking they were correct, it was a conservative monarchist group, who, if repressions and restrictions were removed, could be a loyal basis of support for both Nicholas II and for Nicholas II's government. As such, the old believer figures who entered into the Duma, that is the parliament created after 1905, were a much courted after group by various Russian governments, who believed precisely the old believers could now be relied upon to provide loyalty and stability in these difficult times to Nicholas II's faltering regime. So just to offer you some conclusions then about old belief. Old belief, as always has and still does, consider itself to be the true representative of Russian Orthodoxy. It regards the official Russian Orthodox Church, or rather, it did at various points in the imperial period regard the official Orthodox Church as a heretical, or at least a very deeply sinful institution. They never called it the Orthodox Church. They called it Niconianism, i.e. Nikon's church. Old believers the old believers continually rejected the legitimacy of the Russian Orthodox Church. And this made it very difficult for the state to ever fully consider legitimizing the old believers in the same way that they legitimized the other Christian, non-Orthodox Christian confessions, the Lutherans and the Catholics, for instance. Because they would be legitimizing a group who based a lot of its teachings, a lot of its doctrines, a lot of its actions on rejecting the legitimacy of the Russian Orthodox Church. Only the crisis of 1905 finally persuaded the government to recognize all belief as legal. And they only did so because they regarded the Old Believers as a potential constituency for supporting Nicholas II and his governments. Another important thing to remember is that Old Belief is highly heterogeneous, scattered across not just the empire itself, but abroad in various different contexts. It is never a single unified movement. Even within these two broad divisions of priestly and priestless, there are many, many different groups adopting many, many different social practices, many different relationships with the outside world, even to a certain extent different some different ritual kind of practices, but some of which only pertain to certain localities within the empire. Now, while it's worth remembering that there were still, at the beginning of the 20th century, some Old Believers who maintained a belief that the Russian Orthodox state, that the Russian state was an agent of the Antichrist, or that the world was still living through the period of the reign of the Antichrist, and consequently practiced measures designed to limit their degree of contamination from the world of the Antichrist. A great many others, particularly in urban regions, integrated fully within Russian secular society. Indeed, some of them becoming great cultural figures, politicians, administrators, and so on and so forth. By 1917, Old Belief had a large-scale public presence in Russian social, cultural, and religious life. It was only with the coming of the Soviet Union and the general repression of religion in the Stalinist terrors that the golden age of Old Belief ended, and essentially hugely reduced the size of Old Belief to the point where it is today, where there's about 2 or 3 million Old Believers still practicing in modern Russia. Okay, so that marks the end of the first half of the lecture. So now we're going to discuss, very briefly I think, because I think we're running out of time. So I want to discuss the sects. So then let's start the second half of the lecture then with discussing the various sectarian groups, the sects, as they were called in Russian law. And again, these were hugely different groups with an absolutely dazzling variety of religious beliefs, doctrines, rituals, practices, and community structures. It's impossible in the short time we have left to give you a really detailed overview of all of these groups. So I'm going to choose a few of them just to focus on. I think, we're going to have a look at the exile of the Dukhoboria to the Caucasus. We're going to have a look at the Baptists, and we'll very briefly consider the Tolstoyans, simply because of the fame of their founder, the novelist Lev Tolstoy. To my students, I encourage you, if you're interested in this subject, there are various different readings on the Moodle, and if you're particularly interested in various sectarian groups, then you can go and access these readings and research them for yourselves. Here I'm just going to give you a very brief overview of the state's general practices towards them and the fates, the lives they led and the fates that occurred to them because of state-led persecution. So in any case, within Russia, we can talk about 2 sorts of sects. The first one, which is going to occupy us for the first part of this section, are the so-called homegrown sects. That is sects that emerge out of in Russia itself and have minimal or no influence from abroad. These most commonly emerge in the 17th and 18th century. Now again, counting them is counting either the number of different sects or the number that number of followers any one sect had is very difficult, because again, these people deliberately avoided anybody official who would be doing the counting. So I can only ever give you really rough approximations. The vast majority of them emerged because of dissatisfaction with the official church. Some disliked the very close relationship between the priests and the state, disliked the fact that the priests often seemed to be more of a representative of the state than a religious leader of their community. And sometimes they emerged seeking a different kind, more active kind of religious life in their communities. So, for instance, as we discussed in the lecture on popular religious practices, in the official ceremonies of the Russian Orthodox Church itself, there was not very much room for parishioner lay participation. Really, this was limited to choir singing. There was no room, for instance, for the laity to perform readings, to give lectures, to engage in their own sort of forms of expression of religious piety or adoration. The sort of script of the Russian Orthodox liturgy was very tightly regulated. And of course, the Orthodox liturgy was given in a language which most peasants would barely understand, that is to say, Old Church Slavonic, which was essentially a form of medieval Bulgarian. Now, just to give you a very limited overview of these groups, you sort of the names of these groups. So you have the Molokanya, milk drinkers in English. Largely they were called so because they drank milk on fast days, on days when fasts were conducted. This was a practice otherwise prohibited in the Russian Orthodox Church. There are the Duchoboria, who we're going to talk about more in a second. Judaicizers, groups who sort of tried to have a sort of meld of Christian and Jewish practices. So, for instance, Judaicizers were notorious for practicing for placing the holy day, the Sabbath, on the Saturday rather than on the Sunday, as is the case with various Jewish groups. There were the so-called Christi, the flagellants, people who allegedly whipped themselves as marks of their piety and in order to push themselves into a religious frenzy. And then there were possibly one of the most notorious and certainly one of the worst groups among them, the Skopci. The word Skopiets in Russian means castrate, that is to say, someone who has removed their genitals. And these groups practiced essentially forms of genital mutilation, i.e. removing both male and female genitalia. It seems largely out of a belief that doing so would allow the person subjected to such awful treatment to avoid sexual sin. Of course, the numbers of such groups particularly of the latter group, were very small, but they certainly existed up until the beginning of the 20th century. Unsurprisingly, groups who practiced such harmful rituals, such harmful forms of worship were strongly suppressed by the Russian state and subjected to quite a significant degree of disgust and disdain by Russian society. Of course, the other thing occurred is that Russian society, particularly in the 19th century, often fetishized these sects. They usually connected them with deviant sexual practices, so-called deviant sexual practices, often suggesting, for instance, that they practiced orgies and other homosexuality and other such socially taboo actions. Now, what sort of commonalities do we find within all of these groups? Well, often among them there is a belief that the leading figure or the founding figure is in some way a divine figure. That person is, we often find that they are directly called God or a representative of God, or sometimes considered to be a reincarnation as the second coming of Christ. Certainly not all groups believe this, and not across time, but there is generally, we see this kind of, but generally we do see a kind of treatment of the founder and leaders as being almost semi-divine individuals whose teachings have to be treated with a great deal of importance, significance, precisely because of their quasi-divine origins. Often, community structures are non-hierarchical. So in other words, there is not a sort of strict division between a strict hierarchical relationship between leaders and followers. Often these societies are much more equalized in how they organize themselves. And perhaps that was one of their major one of the reasons why they could be attractive to Russian peasants, because Russian society itself was a highly hierarchical, highly restrictive, highly unequal society. Often this kind of a non-hierarchical approach involved sharing wealth, sharing land communally. So in other words, rejecting notions of the private ownership of land, the private ownership of wealth, and distributing resources equally among the members of the community, at least ideally. We often find female leadership is not uncommon among such groups. Certainly people like the Duchoboria, the Skopsi, the Molokania had noted instances of female religious leadership. A great many of them renounced violence. They were, in other words, they were pacifists. And this was one reason which put them on a sort of collision course with the Russian state. You can imagine, because the Russian state, of course, requires conscription. It requires a good percentage of its male population to join the army and therefore be prepared to kill and engage in acts of violence. Of course, these groups, out of principle, reject violence, reject war. Well, therefore, there is going to be a clash between the state and these groups. They were normally hostile to the Orthodox Church for one reason or another. Some of them rejected the theological basis of the church. Some of them rejected the priestly leadership of the church. Others rejected the notion of the liturgy, of the sacred nature of the liturgy, the sacred nature of the sacraments, and so on and so forth. Often they would reject oaths, that is, swearing in the name of God, for instance, to be loyal to the state, to do one action or the other. They believed this was essentially invoking God's name in this kind of way was a blasphemy. And again, you can see here the difficulties both in relationship with the state and secular society, where legal arrangements and confirmations of loyalty were often dependent on such oaths. So these were, generally speaking, sort of characteristics you could find in most of these very, very different, very heterogeneous groups. Now, I want to discuss one particular example. As I said, we don't really have time to go through all of these and look at their community lives in detail. But I want to discuss one particular example of the persecution of some of these groups. The Duchobori the Molokania and Schismatics, that is to say, the Judaicizers, the people who thought the Sabbath should be on Saturdays. In the reign of Nicholas, already under Alexander I, these individuals had been exiled to southern Russia en masse in order to become settlers in this new, rather strategically vulnerable region of the empire. But under Nicholas II, this kind of exile is once again resorted to. And this time, they are sent en masse to settle the southern Caucasus. The state does this because basically some of these ideas of these groups, including pacifism, had been started to spread among the soldiers stationed in southern Russia. And the government regarded the spread of such beliefs among its soldiers, among the people who were supposed to fight for it, was extremely harmful to both state, society, and the political goals of the government. The idea, of course, by exiling to the Caucasus was twofold. On the one hand, you get rid of this troublemaking group from Russia itself. And on the other hand, you can use them as a group to settle this very distant region, to develop agriculture, and to develop supplies and assistance for Russian armies operating in the area. Remember, the Southern Caucasus border both the Ottoman Empire, with whom the Russian state is often at war with, and they also border the troublesome Caucasian mountain peoples who had been essentially fighting a decades-long war between in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s against the Russian annexation of this region. The exile was a truly harsh, traumatic, terrible experience for these individuals. Entire communities, with whatever property they could carry, were forced across hundreds of kilometers of travel, along roads which were barely roads, over mountains and hills in terrible weather. Many hundreds died in the transit to the Caucasus. The exile itself, moving to the place of exile itself, was essentially a form of severe punishment on these individuals. So I've given you here a song which was later recorded about the experience of exile to the Caucasus, written by one of the descendants of one of these exiles, Podkovlyov. So I'll just read it out for you. They called us to trial. Before the court we stood. Judges asked us questions, punished us in our cases, read the decision for the third time, exiled us to Transcaucasia. Our heads and legs lost their nerve, and all our limbs grew weak. Black crows attacked us, pecked at us on the road. Then some people fought, and others shed tears. Many growled like lions, and many cried and sobbed. Children, give me help. I will subdue all the troubles in my heart. My heart beats in me. From my eyes tears flowed. In shackles they chained us, and to Transcaucasia they drove us. Even when they arrived in the Southern Caucasus, their problems were very, very far from over. The land they had to settle was largely unsuited to agriculture, or at least the forms of agriculture these peasants had been used to practicing in southern Russia. They were unused to the climatic conditions, and they were subject to raids from the neighboring hostile mountain tribesmen in the Caucasus. Disease and starvation were rife, especially in the early years, leading to mass death. as I give you here an example, one of these new villages of exiled religious sectarians lost 50% of its population within the first 4 years. In the space of a decade, one new settlement lost over one region where these Russians were settled, lost 2,000 people due to the harsh conditions. However, despite all this, the groups did eventually manage to not only establish themselves, but to create prosperous and thriving communities. And indeed, they served one of the purposes that the Russian state had intended for them. They became invaluable support for Russian armies operating in this Caucasus region, both against rebellious tribesmen and against the Ottoman Empire. During, for instance, the Russo-Turkish War in 1878-1879. These Russian religious dissidents were noted for providing food and supplies to the Russian armies, acting as guides for the armies, providing medical support and assistance, and various other non-fighting roles for the army. However, as these communities became ever more and more prosperous, the state once again wanted to intervene, wanted to use the human and financial resources of these communities for its own purposes. And the crisis came when the Russian state in the 1890s tried to extend conscription to these groups. Again, trying to use their valuable human resources to provide soldiers in order to fight wars. The result was that 3 of the large villages rejected this, openly opposed this conscription order, and conducted mass burnings of Russian weapons in their localities. The response of the state was harsh. Cossacks were dispatched to the villages to gather them, and in the consequence, cases of mass murder, mass rape, and mass violence were enacted on these communities. The result was an outcry in some parts of Russian educated society about the brutality with which these otherwise loyal individuals had been treated. Lev Tolstoy, in particular, published a variety of pamphlets, not only in Russian, but also abroad from his publishing house in England. And thus the entire case became a cause célèbre, a controversy held up to prove the barbarity and cruelty of the Russian state towards its religious minorities. And with Lev Tolstoy's help, most of these communities in the Southern Caucasus were relocated. They found land in Canada and they moved there. Now, it should be noted that there are still descendants of these communities in Canada today, and they've had, in the 20th century, some problems with the Canadian state, again because of their sort of rejection of things like conscription, of things like oaths. So it's not just the Russian state. So these so these facets of its religious lives have put it in opposition not just to the Russian state, but indeed to many states. Yes, so let's continue to another group. The Baptists. Now, Baptists, I'm sure many of you are somewhat familiar with, a form of dissenting Protestantism which got its start in Europe in the century of the Reformation, the 16th century. Basically, they're sort of the core ritual of the Baptists is the idea of adult baptism. So, in other words, people should not be baptized as children, rather they should be baptized as adults when they're able to make a full and conscious decision about the nature of their religious belief and the nature of their engagement in the community. Now, the Baptists first arrived in Russia in the late 18th century, but it was not present among the Russian population. Rather, it was something that German settlers, encouraged by Catherine to settle regions in southern Russia along the Volga, brought with them, and largely kept themselves. These German settlers, as part of the deal they were given for coming to Russia and for settling these very strategically valuable areas of the empire, was that they had freedom of religion. In other words, the Russian state didn't really exercise any kind of control over these Baptist communities, in these foreign Baptist communities. However, this essentially changes in the 1850s, 1860s, when baptism starts to spread out from these German communities into Russian-speaking communities, especially in the Russian South and in the area we would today call Ukraine. By the 1880s, this has become something of a crisis for the Russian state and for the Russian Orthodox Church, as thousands of people started to join the Baptists in these regions. They were engaged by baptism, by the Baptists, because of its much more involved approach to religious activities. Baptism encouraged individual reading of the Bible. It encouraged strong lay participation in religious ceremonies. It encouraged strong lay control over the content and structure of their religious lives. And of course, such readings, such ceremonies were conducted not in Old Church Slavonic, the liturgical language used by the Church, but rather in modern, easily understandable Russian. Initially, the Russian state made the Baptists a tolerated faith in 1879. So basically put it on a sort of level along with the other tolerated Christian confessions of the empire. However, as baptism grew more and more popular and increasingly drew Russian-speaking converts, the Orthodox Church grew to regard it as a rather dangerous threat to its flock. And especially through the figure of Konstantin Pobedonosov, starts to put pressure on the Russian state to prohibit this group. In 1894, that is precisely what the Russian state does. It declares that the Baptists are an illegal group. Indeed, not just illegal, it names them as puts them into the final category of illegality, the most harmful, the most dangerous group. In other words, the Baptists, whose basic sort of belief rituals are lay preaching, individual reading of the Bible, various group religious sessions, group reading of the Bible, are put on the same level as the Skopsi who practice genital mutilation. Again, this is a case that becomes very internationally famous in the late 1890s as an example of Russia's backwards and tyrannical approach to dissenting citizens. It was only in 1905 when the Baptists again received a fully legal status. And again, just like with the Old Believers, the sort of period between 1905 and 1925 is regarded as the golden age of Baptists in Russia, where they held congresses, were able to publish a large amount of material, were able to assume quite a noticeable public presence, and so on and so forth. Now, the one group I did want to mention, because this is rather well known, was the sort of Tolstoyanism. named after its founder, the novelist, the author of War and Peace, Anna Karenina, and many other famous classics in world literature, Lev Tolstoy. So Lev Tolstoy, in terms of his religious beliefs, although initially a relatively standard Orthodox believer, in the 1870s, Tolstoy went through a period of intensive religious soul-searching. And in the end of this process, he came out with a new set of beliefs. One of the most core things was that he rejected any of the sort of the mystical elements that accompanied not only the Orthodox Church, but many other forms of Christianity. So he rejected, for instance, the extremely florid, the extremely stylized liturgical rituals of the Orthodox Church. He rejected the idea of miracles. He essentially preached a very materialist, a very grounded notion of Christianity, which again, he rejected violence, he promoted pacifism, he promoted vegetarianism, he rejected conscription, and he rejected the legitimacy of the Russian Orthodox Church and the Russian state. Indeed, this is sometimes regarded as a form of Christian anarchism, precisely because it rejected both hierarchy and the notion of any kind of state being legitimate. Because in Tolstoy's view, any state is based on coercion, and coercion is fundamentally and absolutely wrong. Now, in the 1880s, this idea begins to be spread. These ideas begin to be spread both by Tolstoy himself and various numbers of Tolstoy's adherents, and it gains quite a degree of popularity, especially in sort of educated, fashionable, intellectual circles in cities, in St. Petersburg, and so on and so forth. But it also does spread out to a certain degree among the lower groups in Russian society, among peasants and workers, and so on and so forth. It was a very small group, still about 30,000 people throughout Russia, but some of them tried to sort of form small communities, small collectives, where they tried to practice and live out sort of Tolstoy's dream version of society, a communal, communitarian, equal, non-hierarchical, non-violent society based on brotherhood and fraternal love between people. In a very hugely sort of a controversial, scandalous move, a huge scandal, in 1901, the Synod conducted basically a trial against, a religious trial against Tolstoy, with the result that he was, by Metropolitan Antony Vadkovsky, excommunicated from the Russian Orthodox Church. And the correspondence between Tolstoy's wife and Metropolitan Antony was published and widely made available, published by Tolstoy, I should mention, in order to sort of discredit the actions of the Russian Orthodox Church in this regard. I mention this more as an interesting example of a particular sectarian faith, and certainly the emergence of a sort of sectarian faith drawing largely on the high fashion for religious searching, religious experimentation emerging in educated intellectual society at the end of the 19th century. So then I would just like to bring some conclusions then. We see that many of these beliefs resemble in some ways or come close to forms of Protestantism. That is because some of them draw directly from Protestantism. In other cases, it's a reflection of the fact that these groups wanted to engage their believers more actively in religious life. All of this emerges from a belief and understanding that the Russian Orthodox Church does not meet their religious requirements. The religious role in the liturgy of the church is too passive. They're given too few venues to express their religiosity. They're not really given any control over the priest, who was essentially an employee of the church and of the state. And of course, they can't understand, in many cases, the language of liturgy. And these sects, these groups, offer some answers to these requirements, offer the potential to be actively involved in church life, offer a non-hierarchical model, offer religious life in a language they can understand. Now, while it's impossible to calculate the numbers of these groups, they certainly were considered by the church as a threat, particularly the Baptists at the end of the 19th and 20th century. In some ways, by the beginning of the 20th century, the church begins to regard Baptists as almost being the main threat to them. Certainly, at least in my sort of research, my impression from my research is that after 1905, the church becomes far more obsessed with the Baptists than it does with the old believers. And of course, many of their beliefs run contrary to those propagated by the state. Pacifism, for instance, is a challenge to the state's demand for soldiers for conscription. Oath-taking is a challenge to the way the state obtains a verbal declaration or a written declaration of the loyalty of individuals and communities. Demands for a non-hierarchical society, of course, pose a challenge to the very hierarchical nature of Russian society. And of course, in some instances, these groups are absolutely do not support monarchy. They are Republican or Republican in form. So they challenge the Russian monarchy itself. And this, of course, means that the Russian state has little compunction in making these groups illegal. These groups challenge a lot of the bases and a lot of the fundamental activities of the state, so therefore it renders them illegal. And just to end with reiterating the point I made earlier, well, in many cases, this truly was unjust. And I tried to give you an impression of just how this persecution could truly damage communities. We saw here the case of the Dukhoboria, Molokania, Subotniki, who were exiled to the Southern Caucasus, suffering a great deal as a result of that initial persecution, and then again being subjected to a large amount of state-sponsored violence when they rejected conscription. And these are just people who, to be honest with you, when you look at their sort of religious practices, weren't doing anything particularly harmful beyond sort of collective prayers in modern Russian. Of course, their beliefs presented a challenge to the state, but nonetheless, their actions and their numbers did not really warrant the response the state took. This wasn't the case with at least a couple of the groups, and I've spoken here about the Scorpsi, people who conducted a truly harmful version of genital mutilation on, largely speaking, children, in order to try and save those children from sexual sin. And I think we can probably agree that in this case, the Russian state's persecution of the Scorpsi was to an extent justified. All right then, so I think that brings this talk to a conclusion today. Thank you very much for your attention. Our next lecture will be about the missionary strategies of the Russian Orthodox Church. So I hope to see you then. Good night.